In the Hearts of Men by Proser 132. Chapter 4. Compulsion 2. Loyalty. Jack felt guilt like an acid in his throat, like he'd been sick for days and laying in a snowdrift praying it would pass. He guessed he must have been somewhere in Asia, because when he told the wind to take him back to the little lake that had served as his home base for 300 years, east over the Pacific, they went. His knee ached a bit where the wind jostled it. Riding on the wind was rarely, if ever, a smooth ride, but he didn't have to bear his weight right now, so it was all right. The medicine was doing its job. The guilt reared up at the thought that flitted across his mind. At least someone is. Jack shoved it back down. He hadn't accepted anyway, he thought fiercely as the coastline came into hazy distant view. And he wouldn't. Clearly, this was not a job meant for Jack Frost if he couldn't even handle words. How was he supposed to guard anything if he couldn't even keep from running at the first... God, he was an idiot and an asshole. No wonder no one wanted him around. Flighty, irresponsible Jack fucking Frost! He soared on and bit it back. It didn't matter. It didn't! It was over, and the Guardians knew about Pidge's involvement in the Easter blizzard attempts, and they'd handled him before, right? They definitely didn't need him. Plus, he'd barely survived the first time. Giant hole in his side, screwed up knee. He certainly wasn't Guardian material. Stupid Moon didn't know what he was talking about, Jack thought savagely. Not that he'd know what the Moon was talking about. Not like the fucker would talk to him! He finally sped over the coastline, aiming inland. He didn't really pay attention to where he was going per se, only reeling in his natural inclination to drop snow in his path too near Easter. It might happen naturally, and that wasn't his fault, but he'd spent too many decades trying to keep it from happening to want to add to the problem, ever. Guilt. Again. Jack ignored it. Again. Hours after he'd left Tooth Palace a dot in the distance, he lit upon the top branch of one of the trees around his lake. Not his lake, not really, but it was a secret, guilty pleasure of his, to call it his own, to claim it. Snow was still on the ground, but the dark skies were clear, stars twinkling high above, near full moon overhead. Jack directed a scowl in his direction, and didn't bother to try talking to him again. "Home sweet home," he muttered to himself, dropping down to the lake itself. The ice was still thick enough to bear his weight, but only just. With the tap of his staff, he fixed that. Sure, it was a little late in the year for it, but he'd already done an awful selfish thing today. This was so small in comparison. The wind followed him as he slid along the ice, bare feet steady and certain in their movements. The knee wasn't even shaky any longer, completely healed from the damage. The hole in his side, when he removed his shirt and undid the bandage, was already sealed over, the skin almost pink and a bit thicker than the surrounding area. It would be a hell of a scar, but it was already almost healed. Guilt. 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 Jack sat down in the middle of the ice, hunched over, his knees drawn up to his chest. What a way to repay Bunny, running off at the first hurled insults. Jack rubbed at his forehead with one hand, the other clenched tightly on his staff. God, and right before they left the North Pole, he'd said, "Got that thing!" If there's something I could do, I ought to do it. If Jack didn't know better, he'd have thought Bunny said that on purpose to try and get him to help out. Jack had spent decades keeping an ear to the sky on the off chance the Sprites, and pitch black, he supposed, would try to mess with Easter again. Not because it was his job to do so, but because he should. It could hurt kids, and it wasn't like the Easter Bunny could mess with the weather the way he could. Sure, he could have fucked off, probably should have, after 82. That one was rough, but he couldn't. Jack had no idea who he was, where he was from, but he knew that he could do this thing, this weather and happiness thing. He could make kids laugh, and give them snow days, and keep them safe as he could. He could, so he had to. And stopping the blizzards had been the same thing. Sure, he'd thought it sucked. No one liked fighting, except maybe the Sprites, and they were all assholes anyway. More important was doing what he ought. Somewhere in the intervening decades, it had become less about the kids. Well, not less, it just expanded. It became about Bunny, too, which was weird, Jack thought, and tapped his staff on the ice again, sending Frost over the pond. Since they hadn't even been friends, probably weren't now. He'd messed it up. Of course he had, he thought, and his grip on his staff was tight. He was Jack Frost. Everyone knew Jack Frost messed up. Maybe it was time he believed them. The wind kicked up some snow in his face, and he spluttered, surprised. "What the hell?" He went to scold, then froze. The sky was beginning to cloud over, and the storm sense in the back of his head had woken up, stretching and purring. A good storm was coming, thick and wild, it said, and Jack clenched his teeth. See, that was the thing! He wasn't just fighting against the Sprites whenever they pulled this shit. Again! Are you fucking kidding me? Again! But against himself. There was almost a part of Jack Frost that wanted to storm, wanted the blizzard to descend and make the world go white. That he didn't give in when it could hurt people was the only thing he was proud of himself for. January and February, those he could get away with, and it was fine for a lot of people. But now, in April, I really hate them, he said to the wind, who answered by picking him up and tossing him into the sky. The first time this had happened, he hadn't known how to trace magic, how to sense where it came from and where it led, but he'd learned quickly. Now, it was only a matter of seconds for him to pinpoint the spot some miles away, where the Sprites had congregated to work their magic, and direct the wind to carry him slowly, silently. He didn't interfere just yet, letting them think he hadn't noticed. He hoped. Who knew what these pricks thought on the best of days? Silently as snow, he dropped to the ground behind them. There were 11 in all. Pale, harshly pointed faces, balded heads, so thin that their joints seemed swollen. He never understood people who romanticized the Sprites, the fairy stores and things. They only looked human if you weren't looking closely, and for the winter Sprites at least, they were far from beautiful. Sickly, dead. Jack had learned in his travels the different ways people thought of winter. For Europe, for the Sprites that had come over, it was death. Some places it was sleep, some fear, some peace. The Sprites from those places, from those stories, reflected them. Jack had no idea what stories he reflected, since no one told stories about him. He was an expression. He bit his lip until it bled, then made himself grin. This, at least, would make him feel better. With a sudden twist of his staff and yank at the storm's magic, he took control of the storm and ended it before it began. The Sprites shrieked in surprise, and in the back of his head, the storm sense whined at the loss. He didn't care. Maybe he couldn't help with pitch, not really, but he could do this. He must. So, clearly, earlier didn't teach you guys anything, Jack said conversationally, and the Sprites shrieked again, turning to stare at him with their massive sunken eyes. Gollum, he thought, studying them with a jaded eye. They look like less slimy golems. How are you here? The nearest Sprite demanded, voiced like the creaking of trees in high gales. The Nightmare King said... The Nightmare King lies, Jack spat before he could think better of it. What the fuck, guys? It's been less than 24 hours! Do I need to fight you again to get you to back off? The Sprites leaned forward towards him, and he bit the inside of his cheek to keep him grinning. Please. There had been 19 of them in 82, and he'd won. He could do this all day if he had to. Hold, said the one who'd spoken before, visibly something of a leader. They looked at Jack and tilted their head like an owl. No, like a hawk. How did you survive? The Nightmare King said you would corrupt from his blow. We saw you slink away. Jack bared his teeth, letting the grin through. Friends in high places. You! Friends! The Sprite scoffed. Then why are you alone? Jack hid the flinch well, masking it with the way he swung the crook of his staff up the point of them. Because they're too smart to waste their time on me, he replied smoothly. Unlike you jackasses. You have no friends, the Sprite said, and Jack couldn't figure out which was worse, the flat way they said it or the way it was true. We've assured that, Jack jerked. What? It's no matter to tell you now, even if we don't eat you. And at this the Sprite grinned, and there were so many teeth in their mouths, all needle-thin, all tiny icicles. The Nightmare King will come for you. He's clever. So much more clever than any of you. I can see why you'd think so, Jack replied on autopilot, and the Sprite hissed. Things like that make it easy, the Sprite said, face twisted in distaste. Mouthy, annoying, interfering, so few liked you anyway, if any. Then the Nightmare King and you, interfering, frustrated, so easy to reduce. You kept us from our favorite treats. What? Jack repeated, because... No way! There was no way! Oh, don't misunderstand, the Spirit said, grinning again. Before it was all you and your disgusting hero complex. And it was said the same way someone might announce stepping in gum.
Protecting the children so above yourself, like you were pretending to be a guardian. You made it easy.
Jack held still because he hadn't noticed, but now that it was in front of him, he could see it. After 68, it had gotten worse. More whispers, more threats, more outright attacks, and he just accepted it because of course he had. It had just been more of the same. Jack swallowed down the bile that wanted to come up at that thought. "Come on," he said, and his voice came out sounding precisely as bored as he'd hoped it would. "You're going to tell me Tall, Dark, and Terrifying was messing with me all the way back then? Not actually a guardian, you know. Pretty sure I'm small fry."
"You interfered,"
the sprite said with relish. Jack privately thought that if so much had it been on the line, he'd find it hilarious. Turns out villains genuinely monologue if you get them going.
"An unknown lone wolf, mad and unpredictable. Couldn't have it."
"Okay," Jack said, drawing out the word and the disbelief both. "Come on," he thought, "a little more. Tell me what you know."
"You do not believe,"
the sprite said.
"How appropriate."
Jack bared his teeth again and almost took a step forward before he remembered himself. "Sorry," he snapped. "Sort of hard to think little old me messed up some big grand scheme."
"You did,"
the sprite hissed.
"First the rabbit, then the wizard, the fairy, then the star. He had a plan, and you wrecked it."
"What kind of plan would that even be? Make it easier for him to pop out and chop boo with some kids?" Jack snorted.
"Destroy them,"
the sprite said, savage glee in every line of their face.
"All of them. Ruin Easter, destroy their hope. He whispers in the ears of children and their parents, and so pulls the wonder of Christmas. He turns the golden dreams to nightmares, and now he's stolen the memories, locked them away in his caves and his shadows. Children everywhere lose their belief in the Tooth Fairy as we speak."
Jack recoiled, but the movement wasn't just in horror. Though man, oh man, was that there! It was to mask the smile that almost broke through his control. "Ah, villains, monologuing! Fish in a barrel came to mind." "Thanks, Sparkly," he said, giving up on hiding his mirth. The sprite blinked, confused, their minions crowding near. "You've been very helpful. I'll make sure to remember your face. Give you something real nice when this is all over." The sprite laughed, but there was a tremor that hadn't been there before.
"You think we will let you leave?"
Jack grinned widely. "Think you can catch me?" The wind snapped him up, flinging him skyward and knocking the sprites over like lawn chairs in a gale. He didn't bother looking back. Again, he found himself in between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, oh man, he ran from pitch black from the Guardians, despite having said he would help, which was not cool. He'd go so far as to say it was an asshole move. He couldn't imagine how disappointed Bunny had to be. He defended Jack from his real friends, and Jack had paid him back for his help by running off at the first sign of danger. Guilt and shame were twinned in Jack's chest, made of the same substance, but wearing different faces. When he thought about returning, about facing them again, it made his stomach writhe. On the other, this was one of those things. The things where it wasn't really a choice. Because regardless of how Jack felt, he now had valuable information, a better idea of Pitch's angle, and judging from Pitch's performance at Tooth Palace, he was good at talking shit without giving anything away. And it wasn't about Jack anymore, if it ever had been. Now it was about the kids, about Easter, still 2 days away, and God, even the timing had to have been on purpose. Jack wasn't the smartest person on the planet. He knew that. Hard to be when you couldn't remember anything about yourself up to a certain point, and all of your knowledge was gleaned from pop culture and books that you'd taught yourself to read. But he knew an endgame move when he saw it, the way someone moved before a killing blow, and the Guardians hadn't even known they'd been playing. If this information could save them, could save the first person in some 200 years who'd listened to Jack, could save the kids Jack was so fond of, then he just had to suck it up. This was more important. "Wind!" he said, and she bounced him higher in answer. From the way they were still without pursuit, Jack figured she'd knock the wind out of them. "Ah! Can you feel the Guardians?" The wind was good with places, and not so good with people. Neither of them had reason to interact with them all that much, or at least not people who they wanted to interact with. So Jack wasn't even sure she could track people, much less people like the Guardians. She began to drift back in the direction of Burgess before speeding up. Jack held on, uncertain of where she would take him, steeling himself for the inevitable. It wasn't far. He knew this house. He saw, as the wind set him in one of the nearby trees, had walked along its fence only a handful of hours past, had played with this kid until the lure of the tooth fairy had drawn away. Jack's Jamie something or other. Good kid, believed in just about anything. Through the window, Jack could see the guardians. And what the hell were they doing here in a kid's room? We didn't know. North looked like he'd had a rough night so far. Soot-stained and beard dusty. He was smiling, but the lines on his face were tight. Jack still wasn't sure what to think about him, but then everyone had assumed the worst, and from the sound of things, that hadn't been an accident. Jack wasn't ready to forgive him, but could understand a little better. Tooth was hovering nearby, and she looked all right, if her belief base beginning to weaken. Her feathers were drooping a bit, but she looked otherwise okay. He wondered where Baby Tooth had gone because he didn't see her. Then again, she was very small. Beside them both, shoulders hunched tightly up, was Bunny. And wow, Jack had thought North had looked a mess. Bunny's ears were rigid antennae, straight back from his head, swiveling in all directions without pause or any apparent pattern. His fur seemed to stand a little further out than usual, making him look larger in some subtle way, and his paws were visibly incapable of holding still, clenching and unclenching into tight fists. Jack did not want to go in there. He did not. There was no part of him that wanted to go in and face that shame. But he had to, and he knew he had to, so he jumped down from the tree onto the fence, only to topple backwards in surprise when Sandy dropped down in front of him. Jack swore loudly, then clapped a hand over his mouth in horror. Oh no, it might as well have announced his presence with megaphones and confetti cannons. He scrambled up onto the fence again, and once crouched down, he was of a height with the floating Sandman. He held still for a moment, but there was no movement from the house, not that he'd expected any of the humans inside to hear him, and after a minute relaxed with a near-silent whoosh of breath when no one burst out and started shouting. Sandy had waited, head cocked to the side as if listening as well. "What the hell?" Jack said, voice so hushed he almost couldn't hear it. "We need to get you bells! Lots of jangly bells! Seriously!" Sandy shrugged, and like he had when speaking to Bunny before, a number of symbols appeared above his head, albeit much slower. Jack had taught himself to read, but this was different. In some ways easier, in some ways harder. Some kind of line and a little figure that fell off it, followed by an equal-armed cross and a question mark. "Are you asking if I'm okay?" Jack asked, confused. Why would Sandy care? Sandy nodded anyway and repeated the question, the little symbols puffing into life more forcefully, as if in emphasis. Yeah, I'm okay." Jack swallowed hard. "Look, if I try to talk to them, what are the chances that I'll, Sandy tilted his head again. He shook his head. He didn't understand. "Okay, I kind of ran out on you guys when I said I'd help. So, I'm sorry, but I know something the others need to know, and I'd really like not to end up mincemeat for trying to talk to them. Only North's got swords and..." Sandy's eyes widened, and he shook his head hard, a golden exclamation point flaring to life above him. Jack winced. "Not bad, huh?" Sandy shook his head again, looking more horrified than before, and a few more symbols appeared. A snowflake, a candy cane, and a sword. The sword went to swing at the snowflake and dissolved into dust before it could. Jack sighed. "That's nice, Sandy, but I'm pretty sure North could kill me if he wanted. I couldn't even..." Sandy shook his head again, and his face was so sad, Jack shut up. What had he said to make the man... He was made out of sand, did that count? Or was he something else? "Look like that." "I'm sorry," Jack said, holding up a hand. I don't think we're understanding each other." Sandy signed the three symbols from before, but this time, before the sword could get near the snowflake, the candy cane slid in the way and kept the sword from falling. "Wait, I'm still not getting it," Jack said, frowning at the symbols. "Are you saying, what, North isn't going to hurt me?" Sandy nodded at last, looking relieved. Jack blinked. I'd be pretty mad if I'd run off on me. Okay, that didn't make sense, but, point still stands. How mad are they? Are you?" Sandy shook his head twice, once for each question. Jack's eyebrows rose. "They're not mad." He tried. Sandy nodded again. "At all?" Another nod. "Okay, what's the deal?" Jack said, starting to get frustrated. "Are you just, trying to make me feel better because it's not working?" Sandy looked as confused as Jack felt. He signed a sword again, then a question mark.
Because I ran off?
Jack guessed. Why would we be mad? As to the question. I mean, God, I just ran off and Bunny... He clicked his mouth shut. It didn't matter. He was getting off track. Never mind, he said to Sandy's question mark. Look, I've got to talk to you all. There's some stuff you need to know and... In the corner of his eye, a dark wisp darting around the edge of the house. Both he and Sandy turned at the same time, catching sight, but then it was gone. You saw that? Jack asked. Sandy shrugged, looking troubled. He tilted his head in the direction Jack had thought it had gone and signed another question mark. What, you think we should follow it? Jack bit his lip. What about the others? Sandy gave him a look that said quite plainly that he knew that Jack didn't want to see them just yet, and that he was trying to give him a way out. Jack felt a swell of affection, which was kind of weird since they'd only just met, but hey, a friend of a friend is my friend, or something like that, and it was nice that Sandy was doing that. Okay, Jack said and stood inside the room through the window. Jack thought he saw Bunny's ears twitch in his direction and swore under his breath. Yeah, let's go, he said and gestured for Sandy to take the lead. He flew after Sandy and hoped that when he came back, Sandy would be right. Astor straightened up abruptly, ears swiveling towards the window at the sound of a quick muffled swear. Tooth paused, her hand beneath the little boy's pillow, and looked at him. Bunny? She whispered. What is it? Do you hear something? Astor held up a paw, listening closely. They stood in a kid's bedroom, having met up after completing their runs. Nick had suggested that they gathered the teeth, which had resulted in one of the stranger nights of Astor's life. He'd always known, of course, that Tooth needed the fairies just to keep up with the staggering number of thinlits who lost their chompers in a day. But it was very different knowing a thing and experiencing that thing yourself. He was good at this sort of thing. Hundreds of years spent hiding googs in plain sight made the job easier, and his speed did him some good. It would have been fun in almost any other circumstance, competing against these three equals, three friends, whom he didn't see often enough, and he'd never realized that he'd missed them, not in all of the years and decades and centuries they'd been doing this. It was startling for a number of reasons. Nothing short of a miracle could have dispelled the cloud that hung over them, though. The knowledge that this was necessary, that without this stopgap measure, Tooth could very well disappear forever. And, though perhaps worse for Astor than for anyone else, there was Jack's disappearance. The others cared, of course they did. The bloke had dropped straight off one of the ledges, and it had been so long since Astor had seen Pitch had forgotten the way he could creep like smoke inside of built-up walls and bravery and twist everything up. He'd gone straight for Jack's throat, each word ringing through with a sick metallic sound of fear, and Astor had been so focused on tracking him. There was a limit to Pitch's power, as there was to everything. Pitch had to know you, had to have an in, and unless you could be unafraid of your own fear, he had you. Astor couldn't blame Jack for getting the hell out of the way while he still could, though he'd fair thought his heart had stopped when Jack had dropped like a stone, only to have it restart when he saw the spot of blue streaking away. He just hoped Jack could fly fast and far enough if they couldn't put Pitch down again. Nick feared for the bloke now, Astor could tell. Nick always had felt a soft spot for people who did the right thing. Astor was pretty sure it was the only reason why they'd become friends at all, despite the way they butted heads. At the core of them was a similar drive. And like Astor had in the years past, Nick recognized a kindred soul. Tooth worried too. He'd saved one of her fairies. The only fairy to be saved at all. Tooth wasn't nearly as forgiving or as gentle as her appearance would leave one to believe. She'd always been bedrock beneath her feathers and delicate wings, and as protective as a mother bear. If she'd spent all this time thinking Jack had attempted to mess with Astor's holiday, she wouldn't let that go easily, even faced with the fact that it was untrue. But kindness? That Tooth understood, and Jack had no other reason for what he'd done, leaping as he had without thought to his injuries or the danger or his own discomfort with the nightmares, catching the tiny fairy and cradling her close. Tooth could forget past untrue hurts for a simple true-hearted kindness. Sandy, keeping watch outside for nightmares, was as ever harder to read. That said, Astor could see that Sandy disapproved of the way Jack had been treated, and Astor had not missed the way Sandy had hesitated before agreeing to helping with the teeth. No more than a split second, not enough for Nick or Tooth to notice, Astor knew, because he'd had the same urge he could see warring in Sandy. He had his duties, but God, if he'd had a choice, he would have torn after Jack if he could. He wasn't in danger the same way Aster was used to thinking about others. He'd seen for himself how Jack handled himself, and surviving a escape up with Pitch the way he had was more of a testament to his strength than most anyone else could be able to tell. That didn't mean he wasn't vulnerable. Aster didn't know Pitch's angle yet, but it would have taken a fool not to notice how focused Pitch had been on Jack's presence and how snug he was the second Jack fled. There was an angle here. Aster would find it. But at this moment, he was disbelieved because that was definitely Jack's voice he could hear through the window. He had to strain through the ambient noise of streets and the house's electrical hum, and Jack's own whispering, but he could see him in his peripheral vision, and he felt his spine relax. "I say," he murmured, barely moving his lips. Sandy's talking to him." "Can you hear him? Is he all right?" Tooth said, zooming away from the boy, tooth clutched in hand. "Oh, goodness, the poor dear!" "Not more than a few hours past you were ready to spike him," Aster reminded, her ears tilted. He couldn't make out the words, but he could hear tone, and it was nervous, guilty, pained. He fought to hold still. That tone did no one any good, but appearing from nowhere could do so much worse. "That was before he saved my fairy," she replied flatly, confirming Aster's earlier thoughts. "Hush, or you'll wake the kid," Aster warned, listening harder. Jack's voice was a little louder now, as if he was forgetting to whisper as he was going, words becoming clearer. "I don't know, trying to feel better?" Jack's voice had gone a little jagged. "Because it's not working!" Silence while Sandy answered. Aster wanted to go to the window, try and see what was being said, but didn't dare. Any quick movements might wake the child in the bed or spook Jack off again, and neither would have good consequences. "Because I ran off," Jack said in response to whatever Sandy had said, and he sounded so angry with himself. Aster clenched his jaw and forced himself to hold still. "Bonnie!" "Hushnik!" Aster bit out. "God, I just ran off, and Bunny—" Aster's heart skipped a beat, but nothing followed for a long second. Stars and suns, did Jack think— Of course he did, Aster thought with a slow, sick feeling. Jack wouldn't know about Pitch's fear the way Aster understood it. He would blame himself. Aster couldn't say he knew Jack well. He knew he didn't. They hadn't spent more than a few hours together over the course of the last 4 or more decades. But he could extrapolate from what he had seen, and self-blame was probably the least of what Jack had been thinking. "Look!" Jack said, voice a little clearer as he grew more agitated. "I've got to talk to you all. There's some stuff you need to know, and—" It cut off again, and almost too hushed for Aster to make it out. "You saw that?" Aster tensed. "Bunny, what's going on?" Tooth demanded a little louder. And then a growl broke the still night air. All of Aster's fur stood up on end, and his ears twitched longingly in the direction of the window before snapping up to high alert. He knew the sound. "Starlight dog shine," he bit out under his breath, and a very still, "I hate dogs. Why, for the love of all the—" None of them had noticed, sleeping still as the grave beside the bed. Tooth had approached from the other side, and Aster and Nick had been quiet, eager to keep from waking the dog in the bed. Now, though, the dog, and it was a greyhound, of course it was
up and growling lowly at the 3 of them.
The kid, woken by the noise, reached over sleepily and patted the dog's head. "Hush, Abby," he said, "or you'll scare off the... The kid's eyes widened slowly, and Aster knew they were made.
"The Tooth Fairy!"
The kid whispered, staring at Tooth. His eyes darted around, landing on Nick and Aster.
"Santa Claus? The Easter Bunny?"
Yes, yep," Tooth said, eyes frantically wide, and a smile plastered on her face. "That's us." Aster wished that he'd been on watch instead of Sandy, not just because it was Sandy Jack was speaking to right now, and that wasn't— What was that bizarre twinge, bloody oath? That was ridiculous. He wasn't jealous. But because Sandy could have put the kid to sleep in a trice, not to mention the dog, would have been real helpful right about now.
Wanted to surprise you, but you weren't supposed to wake up,"
Tooth said, gesticulating wildly. Baby Tooth, who had been all but buried amongst Tooth's feathers since Tooth Palace, peeked up and out and darted out towards Aster, of all things. The dog, who had been growling at them all equally, followed the sudden movement, and her eyes narrowed.
"Abby, no!"
the kid said, tugging on her collar.
"That's the Easter Bunny you get!"
Nick began to chuckle, and Aster gave him a sidelong betrayed glance.
"Rabbit man is rabbit man, no!"
he said, and Aster could have bit
right then, honestly.
Look, you great big choke, he said, turning to wallop him a good one. But the movement made the dog lunge, and it was only the kid hanging off the dog's neck that kept the dog from making more than a leap off the floor onto the bed. Aster scrambled backwards. Starlight, what the hell kind of dog had teeth like that? And stumbled to the north, who banged backwards into the dresser, sending things thumping. Abby, no! The kid commanded, and she settled a bit, but Aster knew a predator sizing up prey when he saw one. The door opened and Aster froze. Poor kid, he had time to think Oldie's gonna walk in and think he went round the bend yelling at air. Then, to Aster's horror, in toddled a right ankle biter, hair in many-layered disarray. Self-hairdresser, this one, and she was clutching a blanket close, yawning widely. She began to make some kind of questioning noise, then paused. "Who are you?" she asked, looking at Nick first. He did look the most human of them, for sure. Then at Tooth. Then it asked her. Here, her little eyes lit up, and she rushed over, nearly tripping over her own feet. "Bunny! Bunny! Hop, hop, hop! Sophie, hold on!" the kid said, reaching out for her, but unfortunately that left the dog free. She leapt up to her feet, and Aster dove to the right behind Nick. Pride was for people not about to be mauled! "Doggy, no!" Sophie scolded, and there was silence for a moment. When Aster dared peer out, the dog had laid down docile as a lamb and gazing at Sophie with all of the adoration in the world, and she put her plump little fists on her hips. "No eat bunny!" Nick started chuckling again, and Aster had a hell of a time keeping from jamming him in the jaw. "Oh no!" Tooth said, and Aster looked over to see her staring out the window. The window that he could no longer see Jack or Sandy through. "They're gone!" Aster bit his tongue to keep from swearing loudly. "We have to go, now," he said sharply. "Jack was—" "Who was out there? I can help you find them." Aster turned to the kid, who was already scrambling out of the bed and flashlight in hand. "Oh, no, I," he said, striding around the dog, who bared her teeth but didn't move. "No, you need to stay here. Jamie," he said, seeing a name on a backpack in the corner of the room and hoping it was right. He didn't have time anymore to memorize the kids' names, and he didn't have the telepathic network through the fairies that Tooth did. The kid's eyes widened. Bingo. "Why?" he asked, the same way all kids did. Aster had missed this, interacting with the kids directly, even if, at that moment, it wasn't exactly helping him out. Yeah, I'm not gonna lie to you," Aster said, crouching down to be of an eye level with a tin lid. "I've got friends out there I'm very worried about and might be in trouble. We've got to go after them, and we can't do that if we're watching out for you, too. Yeah?" Jamie deflated a little. "Are you sure?" he asked, clutching his flashlight close. "I can help! I know we're just like the back of my hand." "So do I," Aster said, and patted Jamie's shoulder. "Been hiding your eggs for years, yeah?" He grinned. "Besides, you've got to stay here, keep Abby from hunting me down." Jamie nodded, still looking disappointed, but that was all right. He'd be safe. "Bunny, go away!" Aster turned without rising, back towards Nick, and the ankle-biter's lip was wobbling. "Sophie, yeah?" he said, and she nodded. "I'll be back on Sunday, no worries. You just get some sleep." Sophie scowled, but she nodded reluctantly. She dropped her blanket, and she gathered it up, along with what looked like half the knickknacks Nick had accidentally swept off the dresser, and toddled back out of the room. "What are you going to do?" Jamie asked, brown eyes determined as he watched them. "Can you tell me who's in trouble? I can keep it a secret, promise." "All the friends like us, and that's all you get," Aster said firmly. "Bite. Or don't you want to see what the Toothfairy left you?" he added sly. Jamie's eyes widened, and he dove for his pillow. The second his eyes were distracted, Aster opened the tunnel and dropped into it, thrusting Tooth and Nick to disappear just as quick. He took a quick second to compose himself. Struth-hated dogs never once made a goog hunt easy, and popped back up in the backyard, not a meter from where Jack had been crouching only minutes past. "Bunny?" Tooth said, darting down. "Thank goodness you handled that very well. I panicked. I'm so sorry. "Don't be," Aster replied gently. "Starlight, dude, when was the last time any of us was caught? No shame in it."
259 years passed, Tooth admitted. "You?"
Aster grinned wryly. "I went looking at the top in mid-event," he said. 44, almost on the nose.
68?
She said, too sharp as ever. "Aye," Aster admitted. "Girl was lost in the blizzard. Jack couldn't find her, and even if he could—"
"She couldn't see him," Tooth finished, horrified. "Oh my goodness!" She looked off to the right towards the house as Nick strode over and asked, "We've all terribly misjudged him, haven't we?"
Astor rolled his eyes. He'd say that she had the gift for stating the obvious, but he knew she never said it for her own benefit. It was her way of acknowledging reality and letting others know that she had done so.
"He is good boy," Nick agreed. "But where he has gone with Sandy, I do not know."
Astor went to reply to relate the brief sentence he'd heard. Jack had learned something from what he'd heard and returned to tell them. Still doing the right thing, even when he had every right to fly for the hills. Like it had waited for him to begin speaking, though, something caught his eye. A dark curl of a shape streaking across the sky.
"Both?"
he said, and she snapped to attention. "Did you see that?"
"Still got eyes on it,"
she replied, words quick and light, saving breath. Her wings trembled. "Let's move," he said, but his friends were moving before he'd finished the first word. So was he, and he had no intention to spare it.
"Nightmare Sand!"
Nick shouted to him from the roofs, Astor keeping to the clear and wider streets.
"From what I can see,"
Astor replied, and darted around a poorly parked truck when he saw another wisp.
"On your 7, move it!"
It was a chase, and Astor was no fool. He was not the hunter here. He was being guided, chivied, herded towards a point, and perhaps the others couldn't hear it yet, or Tooth hadn't caught sight from a vantage point in the sky, but Astor knew the shushing noises now, the way they differed from Sandy's. Sandy's sand crackled, cheerful and bright, jostling together in its hurry to become good dreams. This sand slithered and snapped, hissing, and he could hear its nexus at last. He broke from the winding path the sand was attempting to lead him on and shot straight towards it, only to see bright flashes of light at the same time as Tooth called down, "Sidon! Up the roofs! Up! Nick, where's the sleigh?" Astor didn't care, sprinting flat out now, and he leapt up onto the roofs. He didn't see Nick, who must have gone for the sleigh, but Tooth dropped down to his level, the two of them streaking towards the scene.
"Andromeda's light,"
he whispered beneath his breath, because when Jack had said a giant sign thing, Astor hadn't realized it was made of the sand. It clashed and broke against Sandy's glittering black against defiant gold, and it was breathtaking. It had been a very long time since Astor had seen Sandy in full battle mode, sweet and soft-faced like stone, and it hastened its steps. Behind Sandy stood Jack, face curved into a startlingly cheerful smile, and his staff moved like it was an extension of his body, snapping and crackling against the nightmares that thought they could worry against Sandy's blind spots. It was a wild style Astor catalogued in the scant seconds before he would arrive, but not an uncalculated one. Each strike moved fluidly into the next, from the sharp jab of the uncurved end into a throat, to the twist of the crook behind a long equine-like leg, and snapping left to send it stumbling into its neighbor, opening the path for a solid crack across a snapping jaw. Jack knew at all times where his own body and staff began and ended, and dodged like he'd simply never been in the way at all, laughing like shattering ice at their efforts. There was no time to formulate more than the basest of plans, and trust that his friends would be able to fend for themselves. Astor reached back, snagging the end of a boomerang, and threw. It struck hard the side of one of the nightmares that was about to drop down on Jack's arm, and sent it staggering before whipping back around, curved wood whistling back towards Astor. Jack's head whipped around, eyes startled, but the moment didn't cost him more than a second of concentration. Astor wondered in the distant, closed-off part of himself that always remained apart whilst fighting, how many times Jack had fought against these kinds of numbers, to move so swiftly from surprise into the same splintered laughter from before, batting aside one nightmare to strike another. Pitch, striking still at the unfaltering swirls of golden sand, snarled aloud. The nightmares returned the sound with a braying screech that pierced Astor's ears, nearly made him fumble his next throw. As one great mass, they began to rise, snapping at Jack and Sandy's feet, forcing them into the air to avoid the worst of it. Astor cursed loudly as they picked up speed, and he leapt up, bouncing off of flanks and shifting withers, moving before any of the teeth could sink beneath thick fur. He had to keep up, or they would get away, take the arena to the sky, where Astor was worse than useless. Even if he shifted into a flight-capable shape, it had been so long since he'd bothered, and he'd be more of a liability than an asset. Up he went, and up, following the ever-rocketing spire of nightmare and dream sand, trying to keep pace, and knowing he was failing. "Binding! Left!" Nick's voice was full of command, and Astor trusted it, leaping to the left and away from the stands. For a long, terrifying second, he could see the world below, the town not so small as to be unrecognizable, but far enough down that it took his breath away, and then the sturdy wood of the sleigh was beneath his paws, and his claws gouged in, anchoring him.
He'd never been so happy to see the damn thing in his life. "Up!" Aster shouted, and Nick nodded, urging the sleigh higher and higher. Tooth sprang past them, wings invisible in their speed, and Violet Sparks screamed in her wake, scattering and spraying dark sand like ocean waves. The sleigh was almost vertical, and if Aster was thinking clearly, he'd be all but whimpering. It didn't matter. They crested and leveled at last, a great disk of black sand just below the rails of the sleigh, and Aster paused. Was there more of it than there had been before? "Sandy! No!" Aster's gaze snapped to the center, drawn by Jack's hoarse shout, and everything stopped. Sandy was staring down at his own torso, an almost politely confused look on his face when he found the long tip of Pitch's curved blade projecting from his body. He looked up from it from the way that the sand of his body was beginning to darken, and over to Jack. Jack's face was twisted, wide-eyed with horror, and a nightmare could have come along and swallowed him whole for all the attention he paid. Sandy smiled, and it was apologetic. A faint wisp of golden sand puffed up over his head, and Aster choked. Jack couldn't know what it meant. None of them would. He'd never shown anyone the language that Sandy spoke in now. He hadn't needed to show Sandy. Sandy would have remembered from his own travels amongst the stars. "Goodbye," it said in the flat oval disc, missing its middle, and the black swept up and swallowed him whole. "No!" Jack shouted again, reaching out, and his hands closed on nothing. Aster felt sick. Sandy was... In the same way the dog's growl had sent all the fur on his body standing straight up, so too did the snarl Jack spat out in the next second. Gone was the laughter and the wry smile as he'd fought almost companionably at Sandy's side. Jack leapt forward, propelled by a strong northern gust, and blue light followed him like sparks, like a comet's tail. Pitch had opened his mouth, visibly about to make one of his cruel, witty remarks, but he was forced to dodge back under a vicious swipe of Jack's staff. "Give us Nero!" Aster shouted at Nick, and Nick was already moving, massive hands pale where they gripped the reins. The black sand was swirling, titanic thunderheads of stolen power and death, and were arcing up after their new master and the fury that followed him. Aster was straining forward like that would get him nearer faster, Tooth landing beside him in the sleigh, but the distance was growing. "No, no, no," Aster muttered under his breath because Jack wouldn't be able to see the full scope of it, but the sand was gathering behind Pitch, and if it retained half of the power it had wielded under Sandy's command, he couldn't stand up to that, not alone. "Faster, come on, faster!" All of the sand spiked out at once, closing in on Jack like teeth in the world's largest jaw, and Aster couldn't help the cry that left from his lips, convinced he would see not one, but two friends die tonight. Blue light exploded outward, bright as the sun, in the full strength of day, and Aster shielded his eyes, squinting as best he could. The black sand was frozen immobile and stopped feet from Jack's body, but despite the stunned look on Pitch's face, the nearer fear. Jack was still. Then he began to tumble. Aster had seen the way he fell through the air when he jumped up for Baby Tooth, all unconscious grace and innate knowledge of where his body had to be to land precisely as he should. This was not that. There was no control in the limbs, in the spin. This was an unconscious body, and Aster didn't think, just coiled the muscles in his legs and leapt! Jack landed in his arms in the worst possible way, elbow bashing in Aster's skull, legs tangled and twisted painfully, but Aster caught him and held on, curving his own body over and placing a barrier between Jack and Pitch, in the only protection he had to give. The sleigh was there, Nick's flying skills precisely controlled. In the part of his mind that remained impartial, Aster noted to give him shit later. He'd known the flight to 2 pounds was meant to mess with him. At the moment, he just landed heavily, legs crumbling beneath him, but keeping Jack up from the hard wood until he had his balance. Tooth was there instantly, taking some of the weight, and they laid him out on the bench. "Get us to the pole, Nick!" Tooth called, but the sleigh was already soaring away, Nick throwing a snow globe almost faster than she could speak. It opened and closed in a span of time that could have been a heartbeat or an entire minute. Aster had no idea. His paws skimmed over Jack's face, checking for temperature for lumps or broken bones. Jack's eyelids fluttered but didn't open. He was good and out. They landed with a great thump, and there was a Yeti arm in his field of vision reaching for Jack. Aster smacked the arm away, snarling. "Bunny!" He looked up at Tooth, who looked stunned. "They just want to help," she said, then her voice moved from scolding to gentle. "Phil's just going to bring him back to that room you were in before, somewhere familiar for when he wakes up." "We need to talk." she insisted, placing her tiny hand on his paw. "And we need... Sandy deserves a ceremony. It will have to be brief," she said, pain in her eyes. "But it can't be forgotten."
Aster swallowed, forced himself to relax a bit. "All right," he said, and her grip on his hand, which had become a tight, uncomfortable pinch, loosened. "Yeah, wait, I just..."
"He is friend, and you are worried,"
Nick said, having come around to the side of the sleigh.
"You are right to be worried, but we are guardians. We must do what we must, and Peach must be stopped."
Aster nodded. Still, it was a struggle to let Jack out of his sight, to allow the Yetis to bear him away. It seemed as though all the universe intended to make Aster watch him disappear. Aster's instinct now was to have everyone within his sight, but his duty stood in the way once more, and never in all the years since he'd taken the mantle up had he resented it more. He packed those emotions away, tucked them beside the grief and fury from Sandy's death, and mentally labeled them as to deal with later. He closed his eyes. Breathe in, breathe out. "All right," he said, and opened his eyes. "First, Sandy, then we plan." Nick and Tooth were watching him, identical expressions of sympathy and approval on their faces, and Aster hadn't known how much he'd needed that until he'd had it. He'd lost one friend, his oldest friend, the only other remnant from the Golden Age to stay with him. He'd not lose what he still had, not if he could help it. Jack woke slowly, like he was swimming against a current of mud, but once the process was started, he couldn't stop. He opened his eyes into a dim room, and for a blissful second he couldn't recall why he was there. The ceiling was familiar in the way that something recently but briefly seen is so. He considered it in the bit of sleep haze that still clouded his vision. Jack didn't tend to spend a lot of time sleeping. Wasn't really safe with most of the world on his ass, but beyond that, he didn't like to sleep all that much. He could never remember his dreams no matter how much he wanted to, and it always felt like he'd lost something when he did wake up. He didn't really suffer from only sleeping once a month or so, and figured it was just a spirit thing. Certainly he didn't catch many other spirits sleeping out in the open, though if that was because he was the only one who didn't sleep in a specific safe place, or if they slept as little as he did, was anyone's guess. When he did wake up, he always did the same thing, running through the same basic information, reminding himself of who he was. "I'm Jack Frost," he thought, casting his gaze from the center of the ceiling towards the crown molding that ran the seam of the wall. In his left hand was the familiar wood of his crook. "I know, because the moon told me so." Through the window that he found on the wall, he saw a vast dark sky, the stars drowned out by the brilliance of the full moon. He resisted the urge to stick his tongue out. "You didn't tell me anything else, though." He paused, the sight of the landscape finally registering, and a faint ringing sensation to the thought told him it wasn't quite true. Glacier-like cliffs and thick snow clicked into place in his head, and he sat up as a knife of memory twisted itself in his stomach. The moon. The Guardians. Pitch black. Sandy. "Oh, God!" he whispered and curled up, knees to his chest, one arm curled in place and other hand clasped over his mouth. He'd failed. They'd fallen into the fight like they'd been doing it forever, and Sandy was so strong. It had surprised Jack like nothing else. Who could have guessed that behind the kindly face was a stone-cold badass? Now, Jack, that was for sure. Pitch kept trying to use the sand stuff to get at Sandy's back, to try to get an advantage, and Jack had covered for him and trusted Sandy to handle Pitch. He'd hoped the Guardians would show up quickly, and they had. Tooth's hands like claws and North's swords like silver light. Bunny's boomerang had saved Jack a nasty bite, too, and probably a broken arm. But he'd not even had time to say thanks before the sand was at their feet. Then they were moving up, and Jack knew that was bad. Knew they were caught between the hammer of pitch black and the anvil of black sand. Bunny had been chasing them up, but the sand was so fast, and Jack almost shouted when Bunny leapt, only to be caught by the sleigh, and then... "Sandy!" Jack whispered and got to his feet. He could walk on snow and on ice, no problem, but somehow the tile beneath him felt cold. He was at North's workshop, he could see that. It was the same room as before, but there was no one in it. He looked first for the tall ears, but then cut it out. Sandy had said no one was mad at him, but he just failed to keep Sandy safe. He'd killed the Sandman, if not directly, then definitely through neglect. He'd let the sand creep up between them. He was responsible, even if the Guardians by some miracle didn't hit him now.
Well, he was doing a good enough job of it on his own. He still needed to tell them what he'd learned, though. Even if it seemed pale and weak beside Sandy's death, they still needed to know. He'd have to tell them no matter what, and then they could decide what they wanted to do. He could never make up for what had happened, but he could make sure it didn't happen to another one. Resolve straightened his spine. Good, he needed it. He opened the door and peered cautiously out of the hallway. It was dark and no one was there. It was also very quiet, something that Jack didn't suspect was the norm around here. He thought he could hear very faint sounds off to his right, though, and set off in that direction, staff in hand. As he went, flickering light grew strong, guiding him through the twisting hallways, and he finally came out to a massive wide-open space and frozen place. Candles were lit everywhere, on every surface. The Yetis were gathered up on the balconies, crowded together and solemn-faced, and even the elves were muted. In the center of the room, holding hands and heads bowed, were the guardians. Jack could recognize a funeral when he saw one. He held so still, feeling out of place. He didn't belong here. He was an intruder on their grief. Their rightful grief worth so much more than the jumbled tangle of pain and guilt in his chest, because they'd been Sandy's friend. He'd only talked to Sandy for a few minutes. It wasn't as important. Jack flinched as Bunny's ears tilted backwards and his head turned. He stumbled backwards and fled back the way he'd come. Stupid, stupid! He cursed himself, trying to keep his footsteps silent as he could. Running away again. I'm always running away. Could my timing have been worse, riding on Sandy's funeral like the jerk I am? Froze white. White. Jack fell still involuntarily, just outside the door he'd emerged from. He had no choice. His muscles locked up on him, frozen with confusion and fear. He'd meant to go in, pretend he'd not emerged at all until they came for him. They would. They had to. They'd want answers. Hell, Jack wanted answers. He could have sat and waited and thought about what he was going to say, not stare at the door unseeing, because he'd not heard Bunny following. He forced his head to turn. Bunny stood in the dim hallway, shouted and still, paw held up before his chest as if he'd been reaching but thought better of it. The thought made Jack flinch, and Bunny must have seen it because he stepped nearer. It wasn't in Jack's space yet, but he tensed anyway. Why did you run? Bunny asked bluntly, and in some ways that was a relief. It was familiar. Which time? Jack replied in lieu of an answer, because he wasn't sure which question was being asked. He hated how bitter he sounded, but he couldn't retract it or change it once it was in the air. Bunny's ears twitched. Jack couldn't see his expression well in the dim light, but thought that the new angle didn't look aggressive, which was good, he thought. What do you mean? Bunny said slowly. Just now. Getting me before. Jack shivered. That wasn't your fault. Jack backed up outright, the words like cuts in his skin. What? That wasn't your fault. Bunny repeated, the tone precisely the same as it was before. Patient, calm. Pitch black. You've never had to deal with him before. You wouldn't know how he works. He meets you once and he knows your fears, knows your weaknesses. Bunny's ears twitched again. That's why he's so bloody hard to keep down. They give you the good oil. Is that supposed to be comforting? Jack asked after a moment. It came out harsher than he'd meant, but he couldn't stop the words once they'd started. Then I'd been so scared I fucking ran! I promised! And then Sandy... There was a quick jerk of Bunny's frame, and Jack snapped his mouth closed, taking another step back, well out of range. Bunny held very still after that, eyes firmly on Jack's. Another moment passed. I heard some of what you said to him, but Jess, Bunny said after a moment. Jack relaxed a little. Bunny was here after the information. Good, that was something Jack could deal with. Yeah, I found out something. I was hoping to tell you all, but I guess that won't be happening. Bunny didn't move. Why not? Jack blinked. I'll tell you. Why not the others? Because you can, Jack said, bewildered now. That way they don't have to see me. Bunny's entire body was tense. Jack could see it, and he edged backwards once more. Why do you do that? Bunny burst out, words still soft but loud in Jack's ears. I'm not going to hit you, starlight and darkshine, Jack. Jack flinched. Sorry? It was just... He didn't think Bunny Wood was the thing, but he wasn't sure, and he didn't know what was going on. Why Bunny was acting like this when Jack had killed his friend. Holy dooly. Jack realized with a nauseous rush of horror that all of that had been said out loud. Jack, you didn't... That wasn't your fault either. I don't want to talk about this, Jack croaked out through a throat gone tight and dry. What all my good green other people been saying? Bunny said, voice a low rumble of anger. Why would you think... How could you think this kind of thing about yourself? I don't want to talk about this! Jack repeated, trying to make it louder and firmer, but it went the other way instead, caught in his chest. Quieter, weaker. He hated it. Bunny sighed, but it wasn't an exasperated sound, just very long and very sad. I know you don't. I know. But we got to get some things straight, you and I. Then we cannot talk about it. Please. The word had a strange rusty quality to it, almost as if Bunny didn't say it very often.
Jack didn't think he did.
Jack hung his head. Well, at least you couldn't run away from this. First off, I'm not mad at you, Bunny began, voice low, pitched soothingly. None of this was your fault. You've been thrown head first into this hole, and that's not on you. Second, I am not going to hit you, alright? Yeah, okay, Jack said when Bunny had been quiet a moment, clearly waiting for a moment. I'm not, Bunny repeated. You're my friend, Jack. Jack kept looking at the floor because he couldn't deal with this. It was so much in so little time. The number of crazy, batshit, insane things that had happened to him was way out of proportion to the number of hours that had gone by, and he knew it wasn't going to get any easier, but fuck if he wouldn't give his right arm for some more time! Third, Bunny continued, naked tooth aren't going to do anything to you either. I know you had a rough start with them. Well, they had a rough start with you. Bunny corrected himself, sounding wry. But they don't think badly of you. They're worried. What the hell for? Jack muttered, not quite able to keep the words in. Well, you did knock yourself out for 2 hours, Bunny said, and held off pitch again for the second time today. Jack looked up startled and saw that Bunny had edged nearer, still out of Jack's personal space, but closing the distance Jack had created. You've done more than just about anyone else today, and we went out and collected the teeth, Bunny said, and he stood tall, ears pitched forward, eyes bright and boring into Jack's. None of us blame you, and none of us hate you, and none of us are going to hurt you or ask you to leave. He took a deep breath. Nor will we make you stay if you don't want to, but we could use your help if you're still willing to give it. Jack held very, very still, mind chasing open-ended questions like flakes of snow on the breeze. They didn't... Maybe Bunny was... But Bunny didn't lie. Bunny had believed him, had followed him, and said... And Sandy had... Jack bowed his head again. Okay, I believe you. Do you want to go? Bunny asked. Jack shook his head. No, I learned something while I was gone. You guys need to know. After? What comes after? Jack asked helplessly, looking back up. Sandy's gone! Bunny nodded, and Jack still couldn't see his expression clearly, but thought he could make out the quirk of a sad smile. Yes. And the words were heavy in the air. But Sandy wasn't much one for wasting time, if he thought something needed doing. And I've got an idea. Jack summoned up a weak grin, the best he could do. A plan, huh? Now I'm worried! Belt up, Bunny said, but it was good-natured. Come on, let's go talk to the others. You'll tell us what you know, and I'll tell you a lot my idea. Jack nodded, hands still tight on his staff, and opened his mouth to say something like, thank you, though he wasn't sure what he would have said precisely. Just something that was like that. Instead, a small buzzing sound filled the air, and a second later, Baby Tooth came barreling around the corner, all but banging into Jack's nose and almost poking his eye out in her haste. Jack didn't have time to panic because she'd already begun chirping at him furiously, hugging his nose and poking his cheek alternately like she couldn't decide which one was more important in the moment. Jack gave in and laughed. Hey, Baby Tooth, he said, and she chirped louder. What, did I worry you? A much louder, much more annoyed chirp, and Jack blinked. Really? Come on, don't pull my leg. She hugged his nose tightly, knocked her minuscule fist against his forehead, and then dropped down to sit in the fold of his hood, looking quite pleased with herself. Find yourself another friend, then? Bunny asked, and when Jack looked over, he was shaking a little. From suppressed laughter, Jack realized. Go, maybe you'll listen to this one. Jack stuck out his tongue. "Come on, I listen to you," he said, and when Bunny turned and started walking back the way they'd came, Jack followed. "Haven't told you what to do enough to be sure, mate," Bunny replied, and Jack paused at that. Huh. They really hadn't spent all that much time around one another, he knew. Then why do I... He began to think, but then thought about it all. From the beginning, Bunny had been reserved, but he'd never been mean the way so many other spirits were. He'd been neutral, and probably would have been friendly if Jack hadn't spent every second he was near him trying to get away before he could be. And in just the past day, 2 days, the count of hours was beyond Jack at the moment. He'd done more to earn Jack's trust than had anyone else for the past 300 years. Of course Jack trusted him. It was kind of silly to ask why, when he had the answers in front of him. "Frostbite?" "Yeah, I'm here," Jack said, shaking the thoughts away. He wanted more time to process it, but he knew that was something he just wasn't going to get this time. Bunny paused. They stood a hallway over from the big room where the ceremony had been held. Jack pulled to a stop next to him. "What's up, Cottontail?" he asked, just to see the way Bunny's nose would twitch. He'd give just about anything for some normalcy right now. Just as Jack had thought there was a twitch. He smiled, relieved. "Good night." Bunny looked like he was wrestling with what he wanted to say. Jack, who had more experience than most but not knowing what to say, just let him figure it out. "That's only... something starts. There's no good way to ask without sounding strange." "Bunny!" Jack prompted after another silent moment. Bunny took a deep breath. "Can I give you a hug?" he asked, and his eyes settled on Jack's. That was a new one." "Oh," Jack said, feeling a bit like Bunny had punched him after all. "Why?" Bunny's ears ticked down a bit. "You don't have to," he said, and his eyes slid away. "It's just... it helps sometimes, when you're grieving." The way Bunny was looking away, his ears slowly tightening to his skull, said a lot more than that. Jack wasn't sure who Bunny was asking for, himself or for Jack, but it kind of looked like Bunny could have used a hug once upon a time and didn't exactly get one. Jack didn't remember the last time he'd gotten a hug, unless Baby Tooth hugging his nose counted, which he guessed it kind of did. The thought was there anyway. Now that he thought about it, really had to think about it, he didn't think he'd ever had one, which sounded really awful when put that way. Jack began and wasn't sure how to continue. "It's fine, you don't have to..." "No, I want..." They tripped over each other's words and stumbled through all staring at each other. Jack recovered first and blurted out, "I want one, but I don't know how." Oh God. Bunny's eyes were wide and Jack felt ashamed, almost pinned under his gaze and squirming. "It's not like that," Jack added. Oh God, why was he talking? He was making it worse. Like, what? Anyway, it's just I don't think I've had one. "That's so much worse. Stop talking, Jack. And, well, we should go talk to the others." Earlier in the day, Bunny had grabbed him out of the air and carried him into the workshop. Jack hadn't even thought of someone carrying him. It had just made sense to ride on the wind because there hadn't really been another option. Not in Jack's brain, anyway. Then Bunny had grabbed him and marched in and wrapped up wounds and made sure he was okay and cared. And that was so weird, bizarre, and alien and out of Jack's experience by a few million miles. Jack had been hurting too much to really think about it while it was happening, other than at the most basic, this is happening. Now, though, Bunny was hugging him, and it was both alike and really, really not. It was warm, Jack thought dazedly, warmer than just about anything he'd felt in ages, and soft and safe. That's weird to think, Jack managed to string together, but the vein of the thought was lost before he finished. Baby Tooth squeaked and darted out of the way, and Jack just held still, not certain of where his arms went or what to do with his head. "It's all right, Frostbite," Bunny said, and his voice was louder, and Jack could feel it rumbling from one chest into the other. "I'm hugging you around the shoulders, yeah? Arms around my waist then, and you're shorter than me, you don't have to worry about your head." Jack followed the instructions, mortified. He said it out loud again. Don't worry none," Bunny added. "You're just panicking. Breathe a minute, it'll be fine." Bunny's voice was soothing, and after a little bit, it didn't feel quite so strange. It was close. Way closer than Jack liked having anyone, really. But it wasn't bad. Just different, he thought. Maybe. After a minute more, Jack felt Bunny's grip loosening, and he let go, stepping back. He kept hold of his staff, and now he stared down at it, so he didn't have to look at Bunny. Strange, different, but nice, and Jack hadn't known that it would feel like that. He still felt warm. Baby Tooth fluttered down to sit on his shoulder again, and he coughed. Thank you! He didn't trust himself to say more than that. No dramas, Frostbite. Then he said, like I said, I'm not good with people. And I am, Jack replied, still not looking up. Neither of us are, Bunny conceded. Both the worst company to have when it comes to that, though. Jack looked up, startled. Bunny was watching him, and though his expression was still sad around the edges, might always be, Jack said, thinking with a pang of sanity. There was a faint smile around his mouth. Jack, feeling kind of helpless to stop it, smiled back. Come on, he said, tilted his head towards the big room. We still have to talk to the others. They're right, Bunny agreed, and Jack thought as they walked the last little difference that this was okay, walking side by side with someone new and strange and different like Hugs, but okay, even kind of nice.